for the empire. And these covert activities also led to the direct suffering of a lot of people. We know, for example, that Lama Sengchen was executed by drowning after it was discovered that he had, hosted Chandradas. The governor of Gyaltse and his wife were imprisoned for life. And then we have the mutilation, torture, and killing of an unknown number of servants and other people who helped him along the way. So while there are layers of abstraction and different affiliation and topic of scholarship that kind of protects other scholars during this time period from being directly implicated in this kind of violent consequence of their actions, I do see this case as being a little bit illustrative of how these networks of interdependence between scholarship and states is working, and how we are implicated in imperialism very explicitly during this time period. All right, moving on to the final and third phase. I'm going to call this secular nationalist empire. Maybe not the best name, but it will suffice for today. Here we have the U.S. empire, rising to prominence, solidifying their rule-based order. And while the state holds the monopoly on violence, the new systems of legitimacy are now filtered through liberal institutions rather than the church, right? And then also much of the power, rather than being as explicit, depending on the context, depending on the place, we also have a lot of more indirect, implicit, covert, and proxy imperialism happening through hegemonic soft power, globalization, commodification, those sorts of things. In this era, we have Tibetan textbooks mostly published by a mixture of academics. These are nation-state-like actors on both Western and Tibetan sides now. And we also have Buddhists. So these are refracting old ideologies and new ideologies of both sacred and standard languages, and in a framework of nationalism, of nation-states. The idea where in France they speak French, in Germany they speak German, in England they speak English, in Tibetan they speak Tibet. In Tibet they speak Tibetan. And here we've fully shifted now to this new kind of framework for understanding legitimacy and power. Here, the people grant the power to the state. Natural law provides a rule-based order based on natural rights, think freedom, self-determination, human rights, democracy, and sovereignty is granted by the governed. Writing still acts as authority. Here, we are thinking who reproduces this legitimacy? The university, the press, the law, the market capitalism, and public opinion. And then writing is still making populations legible through records and national languages now. You see a real expansion of the information available to nations and the state during this time period. And of course, we have Cold War geopolitical strategy. This is impacting Tibetan studies to a great degree. And it continues this pattern that we saw in the British Empire period, explicitly linking scholarship with military intelligence, right? So we have the National Defense Education Act in America, the NDEA, passed in 1958, and this creates funding for area studies in critical languages. And there's also been some new work uncovering CIA directly funding a training program for Tibetan officials and agents of the government in exile in America. And we know also, of course, about the paramilitary or guerrilla training of the CIA in Colorado as well. The person I've chosen for this period is Nguyen Nornam, and he's coming from a prominent Lhasa aristocratic family. He's getting a monastic education in Lhasa, and he's leaving Tibet in 1959, and very shortly thereafter, in 1960, he's invited to join the University of Washington through Terrell Wiley. Of course, we know Wiley through his transliteration scheme. And the University of Washington at this time is explicitly getting that NDEA funding for these projects for Tibetan, which is a strategic language. So he's the primary consultant and co-author for 2 textbooks during this time period, and that's a manual of spoken Tibetan Lhasa dialect by Chang and Schetz, and then Goldstein, of course, he's a co-author, credited as co-author on that. So I think the point here is, what's added to our spreadsheet, the point here is that, you know, as we're kind of solidifying this idea that Lhasa is the standard dialect to be studying if you're studying spoken Tibetan, we are emphasizing particular people's speech who come from particular backgrounds, right? Elite, educated, Lhasa, and that erases all the other, you know, vast continuum of variation across Tibetan languages, Tibetic languages. And then another pattern we see emerge during this time period is that we see co-authorship become very much more frequent. And this is, you know, a Western author is going to add a Tibetan co-author, often vice versa as well. Tibetan co-author is going to have a Western co-author. And, you know, in line with liberalism, this is adding legitimacy to the publications that are coming out at the time. So in conclusion, you know, our scholarship is kind of existing within this complex web of interdependencies where we have ideologies working to legitimize states that they are associated with, and we're also reflecting and refracting ideologies that are illiberal as well during these time periods, standard language ideologies, nationalisms, benefiting certain social groups, identities, and languages above, over, and at the expense of the other social groups and identities that also exist. States are then spending the cultural capital they accrue by supporting these kind of liberal projects to justify cover for their expansion of power, whether that's hegemonic soft power or whether that's materially expressed in ways that are explicitly exploitative and violent. And so I think, you know, the times we're living in today are kind of like peeling back some of these layers. We see that they are still undercurrents that have only been laminated by these ideologies. And we might be finding ourselves also, I'm on a point in a time of transition, and you know, we're not sure what's coming next. Print capitalism has dominated for quite a long time, but it appears that we're moving towards digital media quickly, and you know, the state is finding more and more ways of making their populations legible when it comes to mass surveillance and social media, behavioral biometrics, behavioral patterns, those sorts of things. So. What are we transitioning towards? And that's kind of what I wanted to end my presentation.
We do the clap here. Thank you so much.
Good job, Dirk.
So let's switch to another presentation. Just give me a second, please. And I will invite Kyle once I share the slides. Boom. Okay, great. Kyle, please, the floor is yours. Okay, it should work for you.
Alright, thank you very much. Alright, hello everyone, welcome to my presentation, Through the Psychedelic Bardo, Tibetan Buddhism and American Cultures of Consciousness. Alright, so, first a story. So this week I am staying at an apartment in Nepal whose owner owns a bar just outside Bodha, a Tibetan Buddhist pilgrimage site in Kathmandu. The bar is themed around rock music and hippie counterculture, primarily American and primarily of the 1960s and 1970s. In addition to a smattering of young Nepalis, the bar's main demographic is older Western expats and frequent foreign visitors to Bodha, many deeply immersed in serious studies of the area's Buddhist culture. They gather at the bar/cafe/restaurant for frequent live music nights celebrating bands like the Grateful Dead. In fact, just a few weeks ago, they had a birthday party tribute night for Jerry Garcia, the group's late lead singer and guitarist. So, those of us who have traveled to Tibetan Buddhist hotspots like Dharamsala, Ladakh, and Sikkim have likely encountered similar scenes. What is it that makes this connection between hippie counterculture and Tibetan Buddhism so commonplace and to many seem so natural? And where did this connection come from is what I want to dig into. How can we begin to dig deeper into this story? You might say, well, you know, a lot of hippies traveled to Nepal and India in the 60s and 70s, and it sort of lasts this lasting impact on the culture, so many are still there. But to get beyond that, to why were they drawn to come to India and Nepal, one thread to start tugging at in an attempt to begin to unravel this tangled web is a 1964 book titled The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, written by Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner. While Tibetan Buddhist scholars have typically written off this work as a forgotten relic of 1960s excess, it is in actuality a powerful and important landmark in the interweaving of psychedelics, hippie counterculture, and Tibetan Buddhism in the American popular imagination. So this brings me to my thesis. The significance of the psychedelic experience lies not simply in its historical influence on a first generation of American seekers, but in continuing to act as a model both of and for, I'll explain what I mean by that, for a durable cultural association between psychedelic consciousness and Tibetan Buddhism. So by presenting Tibetan Buddhist concepts as a framework for understanding psychedelic experience, the book helped make Tibetan Buddhism intelligible to Western seekers as a tradition concerned primarily with altered states, ego dissolution, and consciousness transformation. So this association has persisted well beyond the 60s acid religion heyday, continuing to shape representations and pathways into Tibetan Buddhism in the United States and beyond. In other words, what I want to argue, and this is my attempt to say something a little bold, is American Dharma is hippie Dharma. Hippie Dharma is a book I just found here in Nepal a few days ago and purchased. So by a model both of and for, I will say that I'm drawing on Clifford Geertz's concept that expresses how cultural patterns not only reflect reality, but shape it. So I'm not saying that this book invented an association between psychedelics and Tibetan Buddhism necessarily, but rather it acts as what we might call a powerful refraction point, to draw back to our panel theme regarding this association. It took existing currents among hip intellectuals of the time and disseminated them to a more mass audience. And it was indeed a hit. As Eric Davis points out, less than 2 years after publication, the book had entered its 4th hardcover printing, and in 1966 there was even a Folkways record recording made with the authors reading selections from the text, so you can just play that record when you're doing your thing. Okay, so what do I mean by hippies? This is another little theoretical term I have a preliminary sort of description of. So what I'm thinking of is someone whose primary goal is a utopic transformation of the self with the overarching aim of utopically transforming the world. So hippies will utilize a variety of techniques in pursuit of this transformation, from psychedelics to meditation. And so hippie is a spectrum. I think we've all got a little hippie in us, some more than others, however. And in this book, we can see a prime model of how psychedelics and Buddhism are both coming to be seen in the 60s as powerful tools for personal transformation. And I think this dream of transformation still animates Tibetan Buddhism in the United States for many American converts. All right, so let's get back to looking at the book, The Psychedelic Experience. In order to talk about this, first we'll talk about the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So quick summary of that, in 1927, a theosophist named Walter Evans Wentz, with the aid of his Tibetan acquaintance Lama Kazi Dao Samdup here, about whom not much is known, published a translation of a fragment of a 14th century corpus of Tibetan text known as the Bardo Total. So playing off the popularity of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Evans Wentz titled this publication the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And basically the core purpose of the work is to guide a person through 3 main after-death stages, termed bardos, in order to attain enlightenment or at the least a favorable rebirth. Evans Wentz beefed out his translated text, translated by Lama Kazi Dao Samdup, with his own extensive commentaries and interpretations on the material, giving it this underlying theosophical bent. And this was a big hit and continues to be actually, but by the 1960s it was an enduring bestseller and widely accepted, according to scholar Donald Lopez, as a timeless world spiritual classic. So then we get to the early 1960s when these recently dismissed psychedelic researching Harvard professors Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert and their graduate student Ralph Metzner adapt the Tibetan Book of the Dead into a guidebook for a psychedelic trip. They're going off of Evans Wentz's publication here. And at the time, the authors are fast becoming increasingly influential thought leaders for the burgeoning hippie counterculture movement, much of which was focused in New York and especially San Francisco, but also scattered throughout the United States at various locations. And so in their adaptation, the authors then relate each bardo, instead of being about after death, it's about the experience of ego dissolution or ego death during a psychedelic trip. And each bardo is associated with what they consider different stages of an archetypal or typical psychedelic trip. And it includes sections to be read aloud to an individual by a guide while they're tripping, as well as a lot of sort of preparatory information to read to get like sort of a framework for this trip. As they note, this also was the first book to popularize the notion of set and setting, which is still used in psychedelic studies today. Psychedelics are very influenced by the context and the mindset in which they're taken, so doing this with this specific sort of framing in mind has a big impact on what the trip ends up being. So as with Evans Wentz's text, they proclaim in their book that the highest goal is for the user to attain liberation, illumination, or enlightenment by recognizing and maintaining awareness of the clear light of the initial bardo. And failing this, one is encouraged to manage to navigate the trip and the state of mind in such a way that one is able to shed one's previous sociocultural conditioning and instead be consciously reborn or come down, be reintegrated into sober post-trip life, having undergone lasting transformations of their choosing. So this book is doing a lot of things, but what I'm interested in here is that it presents Tibetan Buddhist teachings first and foremost as a powerful method of navigating and transforming consciousness. The goal of using the book is a radical transformation of the self and attaining a new, more consciously chosen, more skillful way of being in the world that is liberated from previous social conditioning. So psychedelics are presented in this book as this powerful tool, but then Tibetan Buddhism is presented as the instruction manual for making the most out of the state of mind that that tool induces. So I think it's this practical characterization of both psychedelics and Tibetan Buddhism as being these uniquely powerful, somewhat esoteric, somewhat mysterious methods of personal transformation, with even the highest aspiration described as enlightenment, I believe is what has tied these cultures together in the popular American imagination since the 1960s. Just for a brief glimpse of the sort of passages you'll find in the book, here's a little comic adaptation I did actually for a little class I had last spring. So you can note in this the sort of authoritative, lofty tone and the emphasis on cultivating unity, understanding, love, and enlightenment by way of the clear light state of mind. So this is from a section that's supposed to be read to somebody as they are just beginning their trip. Alright, but not everyone agrees this was an important book. I have a little literature review thing here. I'm going to go through it quick. So this is Donald Lopez, famed for writing Prisoners of Shangri-La. He also is probably the foremost scholar on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, has written a lot about it. And he devotes a very small amount of space to this book, saying in Prisoners of Shangri-La that it has generally been forgotten, invoked only by collectors of Beatles esoterica, who might remember that the admittedly very cool song Tomorrow Never Knows samples the lyrics come from this book, from the psychedelic experience. John Lennon was into it at the time. But more recently, scholars such as D. Osto in Altered States, Buddhism and Psychedelic Spirituality in America have talked about how the book was an immensely popular countercultural text employed as a guidebook for the LSD trip by countless hippies. In terms of its ongoing popularity, by the mid-90s it had gone through 16 editions and been translated into 7 languages, and there have been at least a couple more editions since then. And so he thinks it's been foundational in establishing this connection between Buddhism and psychedelics. And then there's a scholar, Eric Davis, who likewise follows Osto in noting the importance. He describes the format of the book paired to the set and setting influence nature of the psychedelic experience make it particularly potent for shaping psychedelic discourse, practice, and experience, especially during these early years. And then there's me. And, I argue as well for the book's continued importance of the U.S. serving as a model both of and for a deep-seated connection in the collective imagination between Tibetan Buddhist teachings and psychedelic experience. But, what's new about this argument? And after all, many American Buddhist teachers of the boomer generation, such as Jack Kornfield, co-founder of Insight Meditation Society, venerable elder among Buddhist meditation teachers, talk about their standard, it's sort of become the standard boomer Buddhist narrative, all right? There's this idea that in the 60s, we took a lot of drugs, psychedelics opened the door. This phrase "open the door" comes up a lot, actually. And in the ensuing decades, we discovered Buddhism and we got more serious about our Buddhist practice. It's a way to maintain the kinds of transformations. One main reason cited actually is that this sort of transformation that people were seeking through psychedelics was over and over again, it wasn't lasting. They always came down, and after a few days, you're kind of back to your old habits. So meditation, practice, Buddhism was seen as a way to keep these sorts of transformations going. So I guess what I'm adding to this is just this idea that actually I think that this dream, though, of transformation, this focus on transformation continues to animate even after the 60s supposedly ended. I think for American Buddhism, they never really did. Here's some examples of the 60s, this idea of transformation in terms of LSD. This is one of the major acid chemists of the 60s, Nicholas Sand, and he says that he expresses what many people thinking of the time say. The goal was simple. If we could turn on everyone in the world, maybe we'd have a new world of peace and love. I was on a crusade. You see that utopic personal transformation leading to a broader thing. And I'm running a little low on time here, but here's some more emphasis from an underground newspaper from the 60s on that idea. And I think that this is a key reason why we can see Tibetan Buddhism takes different forms in American Buddhism, which is the question that's always interesting me than it does in traditional or Tibetan context or however you want to think of it. Matthew Kapstein describes Tibetan Buddhist practice among Tibetans, featuring things like offerings of juniper burning to gods and spirits, rituals surrounding state-protected deities, maintaining balanced relations with the world of God and demons, offering sacrifices, the presence of deities and spirits, divination, spirit mediums, exorcism, life cycle rituals, donations to monks, and steps to ensure a propitious, literal, not symbolic rebirth. So these sorts of things, they might appear in the way it's practiced by Americans, but by and large, I find the primary goal is this transformative drive. And that's why we see presentations like those of Robert Thurman, who recently passed away. I would say rest in peace, or be reborn in peace, or attain enlightenment in bliss, I think he would like. But we see in the 90s when he was a key figure in presenting Tibetan Buddhism, when it enjoyed this resurgence in mainstream popularity, or a surge in mainstream popularity, books like Inner Revolution that presents Buddhism first of all as an inner science that one uses to transform themselves and then to sort of bring about a kinder, wiser, more enlightened, gentler world. We also see things like even terms like the word psychonaut he uses, which is an old psychedelic term used by Mike J. recently in a book called Psychonauts. So to refer to someone exploring their inner worlds primarily with the use of drugs. He uses this word to refer to Mahasiddhas in his own adaptation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So, interesting stuff. I just have one last story about its continued influence in a more literal sense. So I think this book continues to be influential not just due to its absorption into these narratives and imaginaries, but actually it is still literally out there in physical form across the globe. For example, last week I was in Ladakh at Tikse Monastery, and I met a guy from Denmark that had first encountered the psychedelic experience book in his local library during high school. And this was a time in his life when he was just beginning to experiment with psychedelics. And this, he said, was his first exposure to Tibetan Buddhism. He read through it, shocked that he could find such a sort of provocative book in his local library. And he says, yes, it was my first encounter with Tibetan religion, and it definitely gave me an interest in Tibetan Buddhism. And the book was mystical and otherworldly. I really liked that, which, fair enough. And then, so then after that, he started reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, spent some time trying to memorize the experiences of each bardo, which I think he eventually gave up. But now, 6 years later, he's in Ladakh exploring monasteries with a girlfriend that he met at a rainbow gathering, a hippie festival, who is about to spend almost 2 months staying in a monastery herself. So here we see the interweaving of those cultures. All right, so in conclusion, the psychedelic experience did not merely introduce one generation of Western seekers to Tibetan Buddhism, but helped establish a cultural vocabulary in which psychedelic experience and Tibetan Buddhism could be imagined as versions of the same underlying search for transformed consciousness. That overlapping relationship in the shared imagination continues to this day. And in order to understand the form that Tibetan Buddhism has taken in America and what people that are drawn to it are often searching for, reflecting on the continuing influence, both subsumed and literal, of Leary Alfred Metzger's text is a great illuminator to the ongoing story. And thanks. Tuk che.
Okay, thank you so much. We did a warm applause. Let me stop sharing, and I'd like to invite Trung, Rita, who is also here with us, and she'll be presenting from a different location. So the floor is yours. I am turning off my camera and mic to not to disturb you, and I will send into the chat a timer 10 and 5 minutes before the end. Thank you.
Yes, okay, so we will present together. So the first 10 minutes is about some theory, history, and then we will talk about different Buddhist groups, Tantric groups, Tibetan Buddhist groups, and Vietnam. So obviously, all the Buddhism deconcepts in Vietnam, continuity, structures, and transformation. To begin with, Vietnamese really use the term Tantra when talking about Tantric Buddhism. And the most common terminology used is esoteric school, or Baston, with esoteric teachings, or Masyao, and common division between many within this category is what is called esoteric, Eastern esotericism or Dogma, and Western esotericism or Dogma. So Eastern esotericism refers to mostly Semitic forms of Tantric Buddhism that were introduced to Vietnam sometime during the Tang and Song dynasties, so the dynasty Vietnam. But according to some Vietnamese monks following esoteric Buddhism, actually there were some forms of Tantric Buddhism were introduced to Vietnam directly from India. Whether it's true or not is a separate question. So that's what Dogma is. The other category is Taima. So Taima refers to mostly Tibetan or the Himalayan Buddhism because it includes Ladakhic Buddhism, Bhutanese Buddhism, and so forth. We're talking about Tantric Buddhism, of course, right? And so also there's lots of talk about the continuity. Continuity starting sometime at the beginning of the Common Era of Tantric Buddhism and continue with some interactions, with some decline maybe, with some revival, all the way until the present day. And that's what we call imaginary esotericism because obviously Tantric Buddhism didn't exist at the beginning of the Common Era, but that's what some people imagine to be true. So, and when we talk about sort of going into further details of what Zen Buddhism or meditation Buddhism, which is called Nguyen in Vietnamese, then Tindo or Pure Land Buddhism, and Matong or Tantric Buddhism. Also, it can refer to a distinct system of thought and practice. Also, it can refer to just some sort of reciting mantras and dharanias, which is a general Mahayana thing and has nothing to do with Tantric Buddhism per se necessarily. But quite often people mix together this idea of reciting dharani on the one hand, doing some sort of visualization, etc., all together, right? Also, Matong can refer to the mature form of Buddhism, which we call Vajrayana, the time of vehicle. So that creates lots of confusion, but the positive, quote-unquote, sort of element to it is that people imagine this continuity of Tantric Buddhism starting sometime at the beginning of the Common Era and continue all the way until the Common Day, this day. And so, this is the mainstream narrative. So we have Matong, esoteric Buddhism, which is the same as Vajrayana, which is the same as Tantric Buddhism, and it's divided into Donmas and Taiwan. But you already can see that there are problems with those identifications, with those terms. And so one good example of those problems is this. So what you see here is a person, Tibetan, who can be basically treated as a pioneer of Tibetan, or someone who introduced, one of the first people who introduced Tibetan Buddhism, better to say actually Bhutanese Buddhism, to Vietnam, as the story goes, right? Again, it's also somewhat controversial because, so when you look at his original, how he is usually described is this. So he was born in 1950 or 1951, depends on how you count. And then he was the abbot of the so-called Refractions pagoda in Vietnam, and he started reviving whatever was left of esoteric Buddhism in Vietnam after the destruction of most of esoteric Buddhist books in Vietnam during the invasion by Chinese Ming dynasty at the beginning of the 15th century. And so he started transliterating different texts, composing different tantric rituals, and also translating important tantric texts from Chinese into Vietnamese. One of them, of course, being one of the key tantric treatises, which is called Mahavajrayana Sambodhi Sutra, right, which is the key tantric text for the Sinitic Buddhism. So he translated that into Vietnamese and many other texts. Then what he did in 1993, he went to Bhutan by the invitation of some people, and there, as the story goes, he received tantric empowerment, tantric transmission, tantric teaching from the by then retired 68 Jekempo, the head of Bhutanese Buddhism, and the head of the Drupa Kagyu tradition in Bhutan, which is the main tradition. And it's important to keep in mind that he has this connection with Drupa Kagyu, right? And Drupa also is divided into northern lineage, southern lineage, and so basically he has a connection with the Bhutanese. So according to those people, some of his disciples and disciples of disciples, what happened later, he brought Tibetan/Bhutanese tantric teachings to Vietnam and started popularizing that. But some of the people were interviewed. In fact, for example, just 2 days ago, we talked to the representative of the current abbot of one monastery, who is the direct disciple of Giddens. He didn't do that at all. So he just adapted some tantric regalia, tantric imagery, even started performing something that looks like tantric empowerment, but they actually were not tantric empowerment. And that was done simply in order to popularize tantric Buddhism in any form among Vietnamese. So basically, and again, as some of his followers argue, he didn't introduce any form of any tantric, sort of non-Vietnamese tantric Buddhism to Vietnam at all. So it's just more like an external show, but which doesn't have any Bhutanese, like Tibetan tantric essence to it. Okay? But he serves as a link for some tantric Buddhism. So basically, there were several other people, and John will mention some of them shortly too. But he basically is like he is one of the main people who are seen as by some as like a pioneer of tantric Buddhism in Vietnam. And then in recent decades, we have literally a lot of different lamas, Tibetan lamas, Bhutanese lamas, Ladakhis, etc., coming to Vietnam to basically give tantric empowerment, tantric teachings, and we have people from all traditions, Giddens, Kagyu, Nguyen, and all the traditions. And so you have secular groups, you have monastics, you also have some rare cases of Vietnamese actually learning Tibetan and doing some actual tantric practice, some of them being even authorized as lamas to teach tantric Buddhism. And so Chang will take from here and we'll talk about that part of the spread of tantric Buddhism in Vietnam.
Yeah, so I'm continuing right now. This is a story of Giddens, one of the really well-known esoteric Buddhist monastic in Vietnam. Like the person who makes esoteric Buddhism become more like vivid in Vietnam since around 1990s. Talking about Vietnamese Buddhism, at least the idea is like the traditional Vietnamese Buddhism, we very grasped kind of the combinations of all, as Lava said, it's like maybe Zen, kind of Zen combined with Pure Land combined with esoteric Buddhism together. At least that's how the the Buddhists in Vietnam claim themselves. And now when we talk about esoteric Buddhism in Vietnam, even though the historians, they always said, esoteric in Vietnam like came to Vietnam 1,000 years ago from the first century of Common Era. But in fact, we don't have any evidence, we don't have any like reliable report to prove that point. But at least during the French colonization in Vietnam, so in the south of Vietnam, we have one monastic which is presented widely in Vietnam as a Zen master. So his name is Schmidt or Nguyen or Tibetan also. So he can say the very first Vietnamese who had a journey to the Himalayan region. So particularly within like 2 years and 2 months, he traveled to India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Tibet. He came to different monasteries, encountered and met and talked with different Tibetan Lama or like Lama who practice Tibetan Buddhism. And now you can see in the right, the picture in the right side. So this is kind of ancestor kind of altar in this temple right now. He is the yellow, look like Theravada monastic up there. And then in his diary, he did mention that he met legends of the 13 Dalai Lama at that time. And then you can see the photos of them right there too, as a kind of reminder the Vietnamese nowadays, the connection between Thích Nhật Tế with Tibetan Buddhism. And the legacy right now is a temple in the south of Vietnam, literally named Tây Tạng, means like Tibetan temple. Even though there's no record of whether whether he thought anything about Tibetan Buddhism or not, but at least the temple itself represents the idea of the existence of something called Tibetan Buddhism to the Vietnamese in general. And then also later on in the south of Vietnam, we have the other multiple cities, and he also a well-known esoteric practitioner. Not just like esoteric, but my like combination of esoteric Buddhism and Pure Land. And he translated the text of Victoria's Buddha's Ground Mantra, and to people who really like care about esoteric Buddhism, he's kind of like one of the very big figures in the contemporary Vietnamese Buddhism. And this is his temple, fully in the high central central highland in Vietnam. Besides like some ornaments and decorations in very like like Eastern esoteric style, like Chinese, Japanese esoteric decoration. Then you can see the adapt from Sankha from different, like Buddha, Buddhist style, dating from like Tibetan Buddhist style too. And now we go back to Tupac that Lava mentioned before. So what really happened between Tibetan and the temple, till nowadays we have no idea. But after he passed away, owners decided to kind of got lost. So they divide themselves. So the whole, like the disciples team, they divide into different paths. Some said, okay, the teacher had no any like transmission, had got no transmission from Bhutanese like Drupa can do at all. One said, okay, that is the truth, and he like the second monk, he connects with like the temple, the 69. The temple and try to popularize Drupa in Vietnam, like Richie follow a Bhutanese lineage. While the other one, like the Thich they on chain, in chains, they connected with the Yaroslav Drupa, like the Drupa from like Nepal, really different lineage from Bhutan, and so somehow they, based on the same name Drupa Kegu, and Vietnamese people have no idea what the differences between them, but then they still believe that they preserve their features, legacies of popularized esoteric Buddhism, especially like Drupa. And one of the very special figures here is Thich he's the very first Vietnamese to spend months, years in different monasteries in Nepal, in Tibet, in Bhutan, like in Himalayan region, to observe, to live with, to observe, and to practice with monastics in monasteries. And he is also like the very first Vietnamese to get, can say, the approval or like the authority to be the Lama in Vietnam, the very first Vietnamese Lama who represents the Nyingma, in particular Minh in Vietnam. And he, one of his tasks, his missions, like every year he takes a lot of Vietnamese lay people to Himalayan regions to get empowerment, to experience Tibetan Buddhism here. And then when they come back, they can practice under guidance by him, the monk of Chikom. And in terms of how the pictures of the monasteries or the temple in Vietnam look like, for example, here one of the temple in the center of Vietnam, you can see in the left side, you can see Sangha statue associated with Tibetan Buddhism, but in the right side, you can see the statues of the local coast figures. For example, the mother goddess or the heroic kind of deity that Vietnamese in the north and the center of Vietnam really love to worship, no matter where it is, in any shrine, in any temple. And then this one, even though this temple is located in the center of Vietnam, and they believe that this is a very Vietnamese esoteric Buddhist lineage, because the elders of the temple have a vision of the deities, and then they established themselves, they call Vietnamese esoteric lineage, emerged within Vietnam. Even so, they adapt a lot of elements from Tibetan Buddhism, as you can see in this picture. And then especially we have a cave for Samten Yoshala, which they identify themselves like cultural, spiritual complex inspired by the Vajrayana Buddhist culture. So it looks like temple, and time to time we have the Lama came there and facilitated the grand rituals like a big empowerment and belongs to thousands of Vietnamese people who have to pay tickets to get there. Quite expensive anyway. So a lot of people really like, what is it? Is it a temple or like a touristy destination? Why do you have to spend so much money? It's a lot of mess out there, but after all, the organizer said, no, this is not a temple, but we try to popularize the image of Tibetan Buddhism in Vietnam. So besides them, we have a chance to meet different kinds of groups, different individuals. They travel to Nepal, to Tibet, to encounter different lamas and have a kind of special connection with that lamas, and they come back and register with the government, and some group not like kind of underground practice by themselves. So in this case, you can see they kind of they rent apartments, and then together they offer money to decorate the whole apartment like a shrine or a temple. So some of them feel like, oh, I'm confident to speak out that I follow Tibetan Buddhist lineage. But some of them said, nah, I feel I'm discriminated. Nobody understands what it is about, and I feel not safe if I'm talk to people like I'm practicing Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah, you can see all kind of groups, all individuals from different backgrounds and like different feelings. Some feel safe to follow it, some not. But overall, I can see Tibetan Buddhist lineage came to Vietnam just like 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. It's pretty new. So most of them still just like beginner. So they start from really beginning stage of all lineage. And especially Yaroslav, for whatever reason, was supported and promoted a lot on the national media and read by the government. Okay, so now to demonstrate like how efforts result as outcome of globalization and transnational
They are.
You can just like maybe go in and say you're at time or whatever, and so just so you know to wrap it up.
Like, did you see the messages in the chat, right?
No,
They
I
go
didn't.
to,
I saw them popping up.
Okay.
First of all, it's because their imagination. They believe that esoteric Buddhism came to Vietnam like 2,000 years ago. So they believe it's a part of Vietnamese culture. And to them, Eastern, Western, and
I'll give her
esoteric Buddhism is not much
3
different.
minutes.
So today, in the country,
Yeah, sure.
Tibetan Buddhism is the continuity of something in the past, which is a good thing to do. And then they also follow the
Here comes amazing.
Lama, with like really important for their practice. And
It's brutal.
especially they love to follow some
Bigger than
elements. They love Tibetan Buddhism, like have special music, paintings, colorful ornaments. And to them, it's really like attractive, right? And more people have more money. They know English well to communicate with the world out there, so they bring the Tibetan Buddhist idea into Vietnam. They popularize through social media. And so people
will you
start
time me?
teaching Tibetan
Will I
Buddhism.
tell you?
I should
Oh, sure.
end at like 35.
Okay.
So maximum 40
Yeah, and of
minutes.
course,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we have till 45. Or how long does our slot?
6:05.
Oh, we got a lot of time then. I mean, you could. I feel like that's fine to take extra time then, but I'll let you know though when you're at like 35 and 40.
You were nicely on time, so I don't know this person, so okay.
I know. No, I think it's fine at this point.
Yeah, so I think that's it. Thank you so much for
Okay,
listening.
there we go.
Okay, Rita, thank you so much for your great presentation. Thank you both, actually. Right? You co-authored this contribution. Now let me share my screen again. Right. There we go. And here we go. So thank you so much for joining our panel again. Thank you. Thanks to all of my predecessors to speak on the topic of global permutations and local refractions. That's what we really find quite fitting for given the, let's say, diversity of our topics. So without further ado, my talk is going to be about Tibetophone hip hop and how to keep it real, the Tibetan way. So I figured that I'm not really sure how much is the audience familiar with the background, and in order to speak really about the refractions, I think it's fitting to cover both sides of the story. So the genesis, right? The 70s Bronx where the post-industrial job loss was hitting hard and the Caribbean immigration was flooding the city, really opened up a lot of space to new modes of identification, but at the same time we see a lot of black essentialism in, especially in the form of 5% nation movement. Those really it's a religious sort of movement, religio-political movement, which emphasized the leaving of the slavery and all what was that sort of behind, and opening to new nationalist narrative driven by the black essentialism. And truth to be told, hip hop roots, especially rap roots, as the form of the oral delivery of the lyrics, actually goes much further, much deeper. We see evidence that the Homer epic is actually a structural parallel to how rap is structured and organized even today. We have the stable core of some formulas which are either shared or uniquely individual to the authors, to the rappers, and then we have the unstable performance, the freestyle, as we say, around that, and that's what gives it the oomph, the nice unpredictability. And I think what's worth mentioning, and we'll get back to it, is sampling. That's the absolute cornerstone of hip-hop culture, and that's a way how the rappers, the DJs really claim their authenticity. They revive history, but at the same time acknowledge the lineage and the connection they have. That's, I think, a crucial point to realize while we transfer afterwards to the Tibetan context. Then there is something which I call sort of global loop, right? So at first you had the posse, this is the group, this is the crew, the neighborhood family, and then the hood, the real hyper-locale, as the hip-hop's really basic organizing social and structural units. That's where you gain the respect, the authenticity, and they both are really heavily territorially defined. However, Sugar Hill Gang in 1972 released a song called Rapper's Delight, which actually completely left the hyperlocal existence after only 10 years in existence of the genre, and entered the global charts as top 5. And soon after we have the tragic case of East Coast, West Coast sort of rivalry over who is actually more real, which escalated into the unfortunate deaths of Tupac and Biggie in 1996 and 1997. But by that time already, we see an appearance of something which is dubbed in academic literature as global hip-hop nation, which is a multilingual and translocal movement still built on the black nationalist essentialism, but really something which uses a mechanism called localization. So first going global and then local again, landing somewhere, be re-embedded, as we say, or refractured somewhere, and really rooting down wherever it is, including, for example, I come from Czech Republic, so including back then still Czechoslovakia. But the first arrivals of hip-hop in Asia, I think there is a difference between exposure and actually forming a decent scene. So I put some dates, so just you have some idea about when the exposure or the first scene actually started to be formulated in some relevant countries. And I pointed out one thing, and it is Shotong, which is a Chinese storytelling tradition. And that's an example which gives rap really a ready-made cultural logic where it can just slot into and be much more readily understandable to the locals. The same as the global loop, there is a popularity loop, right? So the Rapper's Delight, just as The Message, which is like another very popular track, those were the two, I think, first really formative tracks which served as a crossover to audiences outside the Who. This is the type of songs which really speaks to a broader audience. And what it brings is sort of a softening of the lyrics and really something which is heavily criticized a lot of times. It's a diluted authenticity, you know. There is a disconnection between what they say and why are they saying it. And therefore, of course, there is a sort of a dialogue here always. We have the Public Enemy, who released in 1988 their Takes a Nation of Millions track, where we see for the first time the recurring hip-hop cycle of mainstream cooptation answered by a deliberate return to foundational values connected with the posse and the hood. And I also throw in like one Chinese parallel where in 2017 there was this absolutely famous show, The Rap of China, where really the state television tried to mainstream the genre, albeit to neutralize it, of course. But it generated quite a different response and gave rise to hyper-local processes. And at the same time, it opens up the China-based rappers to massive language diversity, and that's really when we see a lot of marginalized languages, or a lot of rap in marginalized languages. So now to the Tibetophone rap in itself. So I threw in a couple of examples. The first one, actually, as a reference, I wanted to give you some idea how sort of, or what type of lyrics we can see in popular music. So there is this artist, very famous one, amazing, Dolma Diap, who has a famous song, Gang Chimpa. And he speaks about Tibetan as riding on the horns of wild yaks and ruddy-faced people. And then you can compare it with something like Chonkir Wilpa, where Scar Kid actually speaks about Tibetans as those who lost souls. They are still red-faced, but they lost souls. And instead of the traditional Kusung Tup triad, he inverts that into Tibetans having sick bodies, sick speech, and sick mind. TMJ actually echoes that when he says all the heads have become numb, faces have become swollen, stomachs have become bloated, right? And even outside of Tibet, Namgyel Nangmi actually speaks about internet clowns, so to speak, the trekars, the demons or clowns who are fueled by jealousy, slander, and fraud. Those all refer to the Tibetans around. It's sort of a refusal of the collective solidarity and purity script, which we find so often, it's so omnipresent in a lot of Tibetan pop music. But it also shows us quite a few of these shared anxieties, despite the different contexts these rappers find themselves in. Then there is the question, how do we speak, right? So Tipchik, she is from Europe, in her song, Ten Ten Tik Tik, says, if you say speak proper Tibetan, isn't the diaspora Tibetan like dead by nature? And basically she speaks about the defense of what Zuzana Okurkova dubs common Tibetan, right? On the other hand, Deki Tsering, he has two songs, Yang Sel, which is a very famous one, of course, vowels and consonants, where he says, should speaking the pure mother tongue give rise to the feeling of shame? No, it should not. So he calls for pride and language purity, And in his earlier song Abha, which is of course a word how to talk about the Dalai Lama, that's where he insists on language purity purely. We will learn the father's script and speak the father's pure language. It's actually the first Tibetan rap, actually, according to Timothy Thurston, but I also weren't able to find like earlier sources. So the first Tibetan rap ever insists on that purity as well. Then I also looked at the material from the perspective about what do we actually say. So, especially in Tibet proper, it's supposed to be sort of opaque to the censors, but still legible to the Tibetans, and that speaks something about how the unity, the perceived national unity, is actually performed and not simply stated. So we have a collective Anu or duo Anu, which in their song Rap of Tibet from 2018 in Tibetan actually speaks about the cipher 1376. Whatever you wish, may it be fulfilled. Chi sum dun. Oh, Jesus, how is it? True. Yeah, thank you so much. And then, and this is not now, we are getting a little bit off the rail. I wanted to throw in two other songs of the same name, so 1376, but by two different artists. So you might know Tsewang Norbu because unfortunately he self-immolated himself. And his are the lyrics in Tibetan in the left column. And then there is Tenzin Tsondu, which is a TikTok celebrity, young, super hyper beautiful Tibetan guy who was fueled by Chinese government. And his lyrics are on the right side. And you can compare what they are talking about. Those are the exact same sort of parts of the song, where Tsewang Norbu speaks about common origin, global outreach of the Tibetans, sovereignty and compassion. We see Tenzin speaks about patriotic unity, Han identity, folklorized religiosity, and universal wellness. Very sort of bland and sort of devalues a little bit the song. But what you can see also in the red is liu liu liu, those 3 6s, right? Which they threw into that song, and that is also something which I find super interesting, because that liu 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 actually in among the Chinese netizens, it's a phrase commonly used to say, oh my gosh, that's something amazing, perfect, right? Because it resembles a different characters in Chinese, and they deliberately again threw it in just to again make this or dilute the Tibetan 1376 phrase into some different context, sort of Han Chinese driven context. And then there is the question, what do we listen to? So here I put some examples and I did the hard work for you, and I took a deep dive into where the authors, where the music actually comes from. So there is this song Manika Magehite, performed by several different Tibetan rappers, and in fact it's a remix of a Sri Lankan hit with lyrics not just in Tibetan but also in Sinhala, and because this Manika Magehite is performed by so many different rappers across Asia, they also retain some of the Hindi lyrics in that. Then there is the Dekitsering's Abha, who actually used K-pop beat under his devotional rap lyrics. Jordan 97 and in his track Thang uses sort of it's a fun Tibetan extension of a UK rap beat which features William Blake's verses. Absolutely unexpected for me when I first saw it. Chapalé, one of the most famous Tibetan rappers, he uses Busta Rhymes beats from Busta Rhymes' autobiographical song about how he immigrated into US. And then there is the very recent famous example of Team Tomodachi, which is again a pan-Asiatic sort of a trend. Everybody is doing these remixes, but when you trace the Japanese version and where it comes from, it's a rally cry anthem inspired by late 90s Memphis fight songs. So you get all these sort of musical diversity and a lot of sampling to create these audible palimpsests, I would call, or sometimes collages. And if it is not through just the music, it can also be hidden in the lyrics themselves. Young 13D Baby, in his, again, he contributes to the Rap of Tibet, the cipher, 1376. He speaks about that he comes straight out of grassland, right? And I found it hilarious because it's again a reference to the track Straight Outta Compton by New World Order. And then finally, there is the what do we call a home, right? So I put these 3 tracks, which talks from very different perspectives. So Tenzin Davatsona, in his track Close Yet Far Away, speaks about a tree which is sustained by sun and water. And the sun, this is a metaphor for the Tibetans living in Tibet, and the water is what sustains the tree from underneath the Himalayas, as he says. And the tree symbolizes the intangible Tibetanness, right? So he actually dissociates a little bit from home as a geographical territory, but puts it more of into something really just out there as a Tibetan culture and nation. EX6 Tashi, in his song Rabyeling, actually speaks how he finds this settlement be his birthplace, a place where he would like to die one day. So he no longer speaks about a home as a Tibet, but about the settlement where he was actually born. That's what he calls home. And Jitashi and Keikush, who are both Dharamsala based, they have a track called D-Town, where they speak about Dharamsala and how they enjoy themselves every night with friends and with girls, etc. And they talk about, how with their homies together they go up to the hilltop every now and then. And this is exactly the type of hyperlocalization again, using the posse, the homies, as an organizing principle instead of being really related to a distant Tibet as a for them virtual home.
Time's up, but it's
Time's
okay.
It's
It's
fine.
all right.
No, no, no.
You just keep going.
So I'll have just closing remarks basically because I already put all the conclusions out there. No, here is something which actually speaks about the rapper's agency as a cultural theorist. So H.M. Funk speaks about the Tibetan rap unity in his track Tibetan Rap Unity, about hip hop as a skillful means, tarta, as a upaya, which is now the right kind of way how to spread the message around. And then he only repeats that in another of his songs, where he speaks about hip-hop as a doctrine of freedom, even. And Jans Bob, in his song Ha, actually puts himself into a position of a goddess Saraswati, which is associated with music, poetry, literature, and wisdom. He identifies with her. And the language or the lyrics he uses or produces are actually not his. Those descend to him, similar to what we see or hear with the Gesar narrations. So, as I said, I already put the seeds, everything out there. It's just a wrap up. I see Tibetan hip hop as a sort of a liminal space or a creative, self-reflexive act of representation, really where a lot of things are happening at the same time, hybridizing and coming into new ways of being. And there is a lot of sort of shared anxieties over the language and identity. So I put it in a simple sentence. One can identify as a Tibetan, but can be performing Tibetanness in sort of a wrong way, therefore not necessarily representing the Tibetans. And the rappers are therefore sort of stuck in this triangle of identification between the hyperlocal, the Tibetan nation or the Tibetanness, or the hip-hop nation, be it within the pan-Asiatic context or within the Western context, when we see that like such as the Compton and London, for example. So those are the refractions and permutations of Tibetan hip-hop. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'll stop sharing the screen. There's a round of applause happening now as well. Thank you. So now I invite everyone to join into the chat, and I'll be, I guess we can all come here behind the screen, and we'll go through the chat and answer the questions. Okay, first from Isabel Hendion Dorsey. Dekitsering being the first rapper, I would contend that Yadong Gesar song in the 90s can be recognized as rap. Right, much earlier, yes. Then a group of young girls in Lhasa did a rap song in the early 2000s, and that is something I don't know about actually. So thank you for pointing that out, and Isabel, I would love to chat more about that. But yeah, but they don't release it as an album. That's why I don't know about it. And yeah, sorry about my limited knowledge. Thank you again for pointing that out. I was, or I am aware of Yadong's work, of course, but again, he was not, he did not self-identify as a rapper. So he put some rap element into his other work, but that was kind of it, and he didn't really identify within the whole like culture or the triangle of identification. For a full patented record label, I would put Chapalet first. Yes. Automatic corrections. Okay. Right. Thank you so much again, Isabel, for pointing that out. And here I would give a little bit of time maybe to the other participants. There's about 18 of us in here, which I absolutely love. Thank you for joining and tuning in. We try to stay on time, so we have plenty of time to engage in a discussion. And to fill in the void which is in the chat, if I may, I will ask the first questions. So in the right order, I'll start with Dirk. So you, by the absolute end of your presentation, mentioned sort of the future and how the modern technologies will again transform what you spoke about. So given the timeline you put forward regarding the textbooks, like the missionaries, the colonial, and the modern academia, what came to my mind immediately was like just some basic things such as Duolingo, because it does not serve modern academic purposes, I would say, at all. Mm-hmm. It serves very different community, and what the organizing principle of your timeline was basically the purpose. Why were the textbooks created or the language resources created? So how do you feel that resources like Duolingo fit into as a continuation maybe of the timeline you put forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are definitely an outgrowth of this technology, as you're saying. And I think there is also a lot of, we're talking about the reason for something existing. And I think what apps like Duolingo are mainly focused on is they're created to make money. So we're talking about hyper-capitalism, commodification, and those sorts of things. And so they use gamification to try to addict users to using the app. And whether or not that ends in language proficiency, they actually don't really care. They want to sell you the subscription, they want to sell you on the gamification, right? And the fact that you can tell your friends, oh, I'm studying XYZ, I'm studying Italian, whatever it is. and then on the other side of it, you have tools that are like, computer translation.
Yeah.
And even AI tools these days are pretty good translators. And so I'm wondering, along with the globalization of we're talking now about standard language ideology, but maybe we're also talking about globalization leading to English hegemonic language ideology, where to participate in this conference, almost certainly you have to know English. Like our organizers have done a very good job of, making Tibetan a second language that is available for the conference. But many academic conferences, if you want to publish, we are already using English in all these different domains. And as those vertical domains kind of take control globally, they're going to lead to potentially language shift as well. I don't know if this is answering the question. I forgot where we started.
That's fine. That's a discussion even, right?
But yeah, I don't know.
Very
Obviously.
Thank you for that sort of addition, because as I said, that was sort of kind of where you left off as a cliffhanger, and I wanted to use that against you in the discussion. But you also mentioned which I find very interesting, the sort of the question of legitimacy, especially today, the Western Tibetan co-authorship.
Right.
So even today, you have different kinds of textbooks, and some of them are produced purely on the West, and some of them, of course, again, purely by Tibetans, but they, for the most part, let's say, what we see here in Vajra books, right, or the Tibetan bookstore, those are still intended for the same audience, serving the same purpose.
Yes.
So where do you see the biggest sort of difference between those two resources in terms of how people should even choose? Because in the past, when you started with the missionaries and the colonial, there was one textbook resource. There was no other available to be understood by the Westerners. Now there's, I don't know how many, hundreds maybe?
Yeah.
So how should I navigate myself? Or no, I'm a bad example. How should a common person, non-academic, who doesn't speak Tibetan at all, navigate themselves amidst those waters? How to choose the right resource?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, you shouldn't ask me. I'm super biased because I have a long history with Isukya, and Isukya, created its own language learning materials.
True.
And then I see a lot of the options out there kind of being refractions of many of the same things, right? Maybe coming at it from a slightly different angle or employing a slightly different framework, but you still have, a lot of influence of the traditional Latin and Greek grammar, especially in anything classical you're going to study. And then even those categories bleed over into colloquial studies as well. And then you have this, emphasis on Lhasa like Tibetan as a standard language. And I think when you're, as a learner, what I personally found is there's a difference between classroom language and then going out on the street and trying to actually have a conversation with someone. and then using that classroom language and sounding very artificial, and then trying to understand what's being said to you and not understanding it because you haven't covered that kind of stuff. And so I think we do have this like very strong standard language ideology that says there is a proper and correct way to speak Tibetan, and this is the way it looks like. And then you have kind of a reality that exists other than that. And I think for learners especially, to be aware of that, for one, is the first step. And then trying to gain that proficiency. The thing is, if the more conversations you have with the more speakers, you're getting that feedback loop where you're hearing things and then improving and then slowly making progress. Whereas if you just get stuck, like I made the mistake of just getting stuck in the classroom and in the textbook.
Yeah.
And then, not making any progress for many years.
My mistake as well.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
But speak out loud.
Yeah. On that note, and thanks for having me here in the room. I think you're right, but did I understand your paper correctly that you basically argued that's basically a foreign imposition, this kind of standardization of a particular, in this case, Lhasa dialect, because it seems to me that has for a very long time been, maybe in different ways and forms, a tool of Ganden Podang hegemony throughout inner Asia, and more recently, an outcome of modern Tibetan nationalism, which again was at least initially dominated very strongly by a Lhasa elite in exile in Dharamsala, and there were plenty of conflicts about that. So there's a lot of things, that come from the Tibetan community itself, I think, as well. And I acknowledge, I do think you said that you specifically look at textbooks produced by non-Tibetans. So I get that. But still, I think there's the whole other side of the coin as well, where there are a lot of textbooks also probably produced by Tibetans, and I don't know enough, but I would not be surprised if textbooks already existed in pre-modern Tibet for whatever, Mongolians or other people. I don't know about that. That would be a question. Are you familiar or aware with any of those?
Yeah. All right. So there were parts of my presentation that I had to cut short, but just to make clear that when we're talking about refractions and permutations, I think we are talking about it going both ways. So I wouldn't argue that that standard language ideology was an imposition of the Westerners, but that it was reflecting or refracting this social order that did, this hierarchy that did and does exist, both inside and outside Tibet, and some language ideologies that are present there as well. And my final stage there of secular national does mean to cover both the Westerners who are writing Tibetan textbooks, but also the Tibetans who are publishing. So the LTWA, for example, as an institution that isn't directly, CTA itself, but is very much tied into that, and it's literally right there, along with all the CTA offices. And then as far as, so the point of the project was focusing on those textbooks that were written for non-Tibetan audiences. As far as I know, and I would love if someone corrects me on this, because I would love to know about it, but Tibetans writing for language learning focuses on literary Tibetan almost exclusively, and I do not know of any textbooks in Tibetan meant for a Tibetan audience that treats vernacular as the language they're teaching.
True. Sorry, monitoring the chat. If there are no other questions, I will then move forward to you, Kyle.
Maybe I'll throw in just a thought. I think that just me, my experience studying Tibetan at the University of Wisconsin, there are a fair amount of Tibetan students that then study Tibetan, not to learn necessarily classical Tibetan, but to learn the proper way to speak Tibetan, which maybe is some form of loss of Tibetan that is presented as the standard correct way. But I wonder if that is something that also occurs in like diasporic communities, where people are like, well, you know, we have our Shijak Tibetan and Tibetan people that then say, but we want to learn the real Tibetan, the correct Tibetan, because I've talked to Tibetan students at UW who say, well, I don't know how to speak Tibetan, even though they do speak Tibetan with their family all the time. They don't consider that really speaking Tibetan, it seems. So
Not proper.
not proper Tibetan. Yeah, I suppose so.
Wait for my dissertation.
Okay.
And this is the kind of stuff I'm looking at.
Excellent.
I think there is a very distinct divide between heritage speakers who grew up in the West versus diaspora speakers who grew up in South Asia,
Okay.
and how they view those sorts of things. But yeah, as far as I know, there's no kind of standard or formalized teaching method that is Tibetan to Tibetan. But again, if you know something like that, please let me know.
Try to get you jump as materials.
Yeah.
Right, so still no questions, so let's continue the discussion with Kyle's presentation about the psychedelic experience, because what immediately popped into my mind was that it's, you know, the connections you were making and really sort of justifying the case how influential the psychedelic movement was and how it still lasts even today. In recent years, we have a very new phenomenon, again very popular in US, and that's DMT infused, fueled DMT fueled experiences. And so my question sort of is about that, if there is, because I'm not familiar much with the US-centric context, so if there is around this new wave of DMT-driven psychedelic experiences, any sort of comeback of that Tibetan Book of Dead and all of the good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the Tibetan book, I mean, like I sort of said at the end of my presentation, it never really went away. It's still out there, people are still using it, people are still taking mushrooms or, you know, LSD. I think it's really, so for that book, it's geared towards that kind of a psychedelic and would not, I don't think, pair well with like DMT or something like that. However, I do know, a fair amount of contemporary American Buddhists are very interested in things like the DMT and now the 5-MeO DMT, which comes from a frog, a certain toad secretion and is like extra powerful. I know some scholars that have talked about experiencing this as trying to, you know, get a taste of what emptiness is like or something. It sends you right into that ego dissolution mode very often, and it's much shorter acting, you know, only lasting 30 minutes or so. So there is stuff around that, and I think my interest is always goes back to the 60s and sees that as this sort of refraction point, if you will, where this sort of, the reason that there are lots of scholars out there who do study both Tibetan Buddhism and they're also doing psychedelic studies, like they go together in people's intellectual wheelhouse. I think it's this link around consciousness, seeing Tibetan Buddhism is focused primarily on consciousness and on transformation, as I was saying. So yeah, I think it continues to play out, certainly in the recent psychedelic revolution, if you will. Actually, yeah, I mean, that copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one of the pictures I showed was a picture of the book, you know, held open. There are these little like golden hands you might have seen holding it open. That was from a center outside Madison that is a massive psychedelic research center. It's private, it's not through the university, but they had this sort of shrine room with all this texts of psychedelic past, and they're Buddha statues, along with many other things. But so that association certainly goes on very strongly in the psychedelic world, as well as I think it's there in the Buddhist world.
So why I was also partially asking is because recently I saw some YouTube creators who traveled to India to visit the sadhus with DMT and to get their perspective about how they experience that particular drug, the toad, and how and you know from their perspective how they see actually and compare it with their practice, right? And it was the Agori sadhus, the real extreme kind of sadhus there is. So that's where I was sort of coming from,
Sure.
you know.
Yeah,
Again,
that's interesting.
comparing it to something I coincidentally saw.
What did they say? These sadhus were they like, "This is it? Yeah, you guys got it. We don't have to do this meditating stuff anymore."
The overall census was that it's a short glimpse into what you can attain through, let's say, a very long practice. And I will be more than, to be honest, I will be more than happy to send you the link for the YouTube video
that's great.
later on.
Yeah, there's stories of in the 60s. Allen Ginsberg went to India in the early 60s and asked the Dalai Lama, actually, you know, are psychedelics useful? And the Dalai Lama said, you know, this is maybe giving you a little glimpse of what you can attain, but it's not going to last. And that really becomes the thing that, oh, these profound experiences, they happen, but then the transformation is not lasting. There's also the story of Ram Dass, who was one of the authors of the Psychedelic Experience book. At the time, he was Richard Alpert, but he later gave LSD to a guru in India, and you know, in his experience, this guru seemed it had no effect, or the guru was just kind of like, oh yeah, so this is this state of mind. It you know, it's not that useful really. So that's usually the sentiment.
I see. Yeah. So now with a couple more minutes left, I'd like to also extend some question to Rita. And sorry, I will be absolutely butchering the Vietnamese names, for which I do really apologize. But you mentioned a couple of Vietnamese monks who really, you know, started the whole movement in the first place. And I don't know if there are any records or maybe even first-hand sort of interviews where somebody asked them about their intentions, motivations. Why? How does it happen that a Vietnamese monk becomes really interested into Tibetan Buddhism, a foreign form, how you call it, a Western esotericism, right? And actually becomes so invested in that now there is a monastery, really, and even I would say a temple/theme park you showed to, you know, gain more popularity to that. So can you maybe speak a little bit about that?
Can say 5 days ago, or maybe a week ago, we did have an interview with the monk. The monk, he called the monk, like young monk, like I showed you the photos of him, stay next to the Nepalese monastic in the monastery. So the idea is when you were young, we spent like 2 times through Zoom talking with him, and he's really excited talking about his experience with Tibetan Buddhism. Never end, like keep rolling, never end. So overall, the story is like this. He was born in a very Buddhist family, like very devout Buddhist family. And then when his mother passed away, he kind of recited mantra and dharani a lot, and then it helped him to feel calm and feel not so suffering and sad anymore. And then it's like a routine. And after that, he just keeps reciting mantra dharani again and again. And then one day he read more books about Buddhist philosophy and get more interested in Buddhism. And then he said, okay, one day if I want to be ordained I have to follow esoteric Buddhism. Any condition has to link to like the work of the Buddha. The work of the Bodhisattva means Dharani, a mantra, right? That's what we believe in. So that's why he was introduced to the monk in the north of Vietnam, and then before that was a monk in the south of Vietnam. So back then only 2 monks, very popular, related to esoteric Buddhism, the whole country back then. And then he was introduced to this monk, and this monk introduced to the other monk. So, and then by chance, we met Vietnamese French and Vietnamese Americans who came from, like, visited Vietnam, and then for that matter, he learned more about something called Tibetan Buddhism. And then he got help from them and went to Nepal around 2003. And then he got out of Vietnam, and he saw the maroon rock, and he was, wow, that's amazing. And then he practiced and he observed it. And then he gave him a mission to follow it seriously and popularize it as much as he can. That's exactly what he's doing now. He vowed all of his time to do that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that story. It really helped me to, put everything into its proper place. And I would also, by the end, like to thank the amazing person who is here with us and who keeps us on time every time. And the time has come till the end of our session. So thank you, Rita. Thank both of you for your contribution. Thank you, Kyle.
Hello.
Thank you, Dirk. Thank you, everyone,
Thank you,
for
Martin.
tuning in today. Thanks to all the 15 attendees who remained until the end with us. If you would like to stay in touch, you can hit us up with an email in a conf tool. We'd like to discuss the topics further. Very passionate about that. If you are in Kathmandu, be free. We're also here, so feel free to grab us on the street. We are happy to take a beer with you or something. And I think the time's up. So again, thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of this amazing conference online. Thank you.
Bye bye. Have a good time.
Thank you.
Nice panel.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for making the trek all the way up here.
What's your name?
Stefan, I'm Stefan.
Stefan,
Yeah,
okay.
ciao.
Kyle.
Sorry. My hands are super sweaty.
Stefan.
Sorry. Okay, recording. Stop
Oh
it.
yes, stop it.